Hi everyone. I wanted to put together a brief review of some of the things that we did this week. And I want to preface this review by saying I certainly couldn't go over everything that we've done this week in a 10-minute YouTube video. But this is kind of a greatest hits of the things that we've done this week. And as you prepare for the quiz or later in the year when you prepare for the midterm, you might want to revisit this to familiarize yourself with the content that we covered this week. So with that in mind, let's talk about early colonization. Earlier in the week, we spent a lot of time talking about the difference between Spain, England, and France. This is one of the more popular questions that the AP asks. The AP will often have an essay asking about the different motivations, the different treatment of Native Americans, the different cultural aspects of these three important world powers. So with that in mind, let's refresh our memory a little bit about this. Spain, of course, is the country that financed Columbus, and that finance came after the reunification of Spain by Isabel and Ferdinand. This incident, this reunification of Spain allowed them the money that they needed to fund Columbus's expedition. It also illustrates how they wanted to compete with other Western countries to cut into that trade, that Eastern trade that was so profitable. With that in mind, the major benefits and goals that Spain had was searching for gold, of course. And this had very interesting effects. You know, if you want to have an economic benefit of a colony, finding mountains of gold and silver is certainly a good start. And this caused Spain to have a tremendous amount of money, needless to say, but it led to high inflation. It wasn't long lasting. When the gold was gone, it was gone. And after only about 100 years, Spain is going to start to go into decline, despite this great start that they had in terms of colonization. One term that I don't have in here is something called the encomienda system, which was a system in which Spanish officials were granted land and the right to use Native Americans for labor. Of course, the Native Americans didn't have any say in that. When we talk about Native Americans and the Spanish, we focus a lot on really, there's two sides to this. There's the first contact, and that first contact is filled with horrible treatment. We heard a document from Bartholomew de las Casas about the horrible treatment that Native Americans suffered, the brutal massacres that they suffered. But I wanted to point out and remind you that after the Pueblo Revolt, that there was a real contrast in how Spain treated Native Americans, that Native Americans are soon adopted into their strict social class system. Now, albeit at the bottom of that strict social class system, but still, when we compare how Native Americans are treated, say, by the English, the Spanish at least adopted them into the social class. They adopted them into society. There was intermarriage. And those types of things are important to note about Spain. When we talk about England, one of the major motivations, again, is religion, but this time it's not the expanding of the Catholic Church through missions, it's the Protestant Reformation. And pilgrims and people who believed in Calvinism and Puritans are all going to be motivated to come to the New World seeking religious freedom for themselves. Sometimes the term religious tolerance is thrown around, and I've always thought that that's not really the best term because they weren't a tolerant people. They were seeking religious freedom for themselves. The English, looking for gold themselves, didn't find any, but they end up finding tobacco, or they end up cultivating tobacco, a sweet tasting tobacco that was developed by John Rolfe and Pocahontas, helped to make the Jamestown colony profitable. In class, I read to you a quote from a historian who said that the advent of tobacco was the most monumentous event in the 17th century. And I thought that was such a strong statement. And when you think about it, had tobacco not come to be in the colonies, you really do have to wonder if Jamestown and perhaps all of the English colonies would have survived, would have continued down the same path that they followed. So kind of an interesting way of looking at something that is normally pretty boring, tobacco, as one of the most monumentous events in American history. Moving forward, when we think about their treatment of Native Americans, this is really kind of interesting and debatable. You might say, who treated Native Americans worse? One way of looking at it, despite the horrible brutality that the Spanish were known for, is that the English were far less willing to include Native Americans into their society. There are these famous examples, Pocahontas, the first Thanksgiving, but for the most part, the English treatment of Native Americans was directed at pushing them west. They didn't want to interact with them. They didn't want them as a part of society. And this is a stance that the American government will take after the American Revolution. Easily, France, I think, treated the Native Americans with the most respect. They make military alliances. Native Americans widely will align themselves with the French before the English, and later the Americans in incidences such as the American Revolution and the French and Indian War. Not all Native Americans, of course. Native Americans weren't just one group. There were thousands of different tribes, but the vast majority of Native Americans aligned themselves with the French rather than the English. And then when the American Revolution happens, the vast amount of Native Americans align themselves with the English rather than the Americans. It's always good, by the way, to know a couple key names that go with certain topics. So Isabella Ferdinand, Columbus is kind of obvious, Cortez, some of the other explorers from your reading, John Smith, John Rolfe, Pocahontas, Jonathan Winthrop, we talked a lot about in class, are good names to associate with English colonization. And Robert LaSalle is an important person in terms of French colonization. So let's just kind of go through this real quick. When we talked about Jamestown, a lot of this is a little redundant because I just got done talking about it, but you might remember Roanoke, the famous lost colony. And I only bring that up again to illustrate just how difficult it was to survive in Jamestown and the English colonies. Their desire and their hope for gold led them to pick a very difficult place to sustain a settlement, right on the river, right next to a swamp, not understanding mosquitoes, not understanding how diseases are carried. We have a horrific period of time in Jamestown's history known as the Starving Time. We talked about the cannibalism that was going on, the mass graves, the bodies strewn in the street. It was just a horrific time for Jamestown. Famously, and I might add, we get a lot of this from John Smith. A lot of the history from Jamestown we get from John Smith. So we have to listen to this and with a degree of skepticism. But famously, John Smith is able to force the people of Jamestown. Many of them were the sons of nobles. They were born into leisure and weren't used to hard work. John Smith is able to force them into labor. He's able to declare martial law. He's able to help the colony survive. Pocahontas and John Rolfe, in many ways, if John Smith helped the colonies survive, Pocahontas and John Rolfe helped the colonies thrive, because they are the ones that come up with a good-selling, good-tasting tobacco. You know, back then people chewed tobacco far more commonly than they smoked it. So this tobacco would become the saving grace of Jamestown. Now that you're cultivating tobacco, you need workers. And indentured servants were people who, for an agreement that they would work for 7 to 14 years for the passage over, became one of the most common sources of labor in early Jamestown. They're very quickly supplanted by slaves, and some of the reasons that slaves become more of a popular labor source than indentured servants is the fear of rebellion and the ability, not that slaves didn't rebel or run away, but in some ways it was easier to control slaves than it was poor white indentured servants. And part of that was the idea of racism and a common enemy. We're later, we haven't talked about it this week, so when I mention it, don't say, oh no, I didn't know that, he didn't mention that. Next week we're going to talk about Bacon's Rebellion and how that played an important role in the advent of slavery. So now on to New England, and I'm sorry, I'm looking at this right now. I'm not used to using the screencast all that often. Down here got cut off a little bit, no worries. Just a reminder that it's important to understand the difference between separatists and non-separatists. Separatists, when we talk about separatists, we're thinking about pilgrims, and pilgrims were considered to be more on the fringe of society. They were more extreme in the eyes of the common Englishman. They believed in Calvinism. They referred to themselves as visible saints. They were less tolerant of other groups, and they believed that they needed to completely separate themselves from the Church of England. This is why they're called separatists. It makes a lot of sense. Now, the Puritans, who are much more mainstream, the Puritans have political influence. They have political power. They have money. They're much more a part of everyday English life. They don't believe that they have to completely separate from the Church of England. As the name implies, they believe that they need to purify the Church of England, hence them being called Puritans. The Puritans who come and found the Massachusetts Bay Colony are in such a better position to fund and support a large colony that colony quickly dwarfs Plymouth Colony, and within a few decades it's really going to be absorbed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We talked about the Great Migration, and no worries, it's in your notes, but the Great Migration was a large migration of Puritans, over 75,000. One of the things that we spent a lot of time on in class this week was talking about Jonathan Winthrop's famous City on a Hill speech, in which he articulated something that's called American exceptionalism. And as we go through American history, we're going to see that Jonathan Winthrop is the first to articulate this idea. Tocqueville, who we've talked about, is perhaps the second in the 1830s. And then we could, cherry pick all of the famous people who have expressed this idea. I think of Teddy Roosevelt, I think of Ronald Reagan. And to me, the most interesting thing about this is how this term, this very historic term, is part of the current political debate. And I think it articulates just why we take this class. So Jonathan Winthrop, exceptionalism, the idea that, and I'll quote Jonathan Winthrop, that America is a beacon of hope, for the world. Not a direct quote. I said I'd quote, and then I messed up the quote a little bit. All right, moving on. Let's see here. All right, just a few overarching big ideas that I want to make sure that you know, and that's these early democratic traditions. And when we talk about the House of Burgesses, which was the first representative assembly in the New World, I want to point out how it really makes sense that the House of Burgesses was the first representative assembly because it's based on land ownership. And in that it's based on land ownership, that kind of goes hand in hand with Jamestown's economy. Needless to say, representative assemblies have become an important part of American history and American politics, so I'm sure you noticed the importance there. And the Mayflower Compact simply established the principle of majority rule, that as a majority, they would decide what would be best for the colonies. Because America was such a second thought to the British Empire, because America was not very important, it wasn't on their radar